Okay, so the test plan, and this is kind of like the documentation end of stuff. And we might say documentation, yuck, don't like it whatsoever, but it is actually very important. And the subtitle here, your rule book on how to test a specific application, is actually very apt. Okay, because what we're looking at here is we want to have a kind of a guidelines on what we should do before we actually start jumping into testing. Okay, and that's what our test plan is. Now, as mentioned before, there are companies out there that actually don't produce applications. They are testing companies. Okay, there's one here in locally Celtic Testing. So their business is testing. There are also situations where you will have a test department, okay, or quality assurance department in an organization, and their role in the organization is testing, okay. Uh, there will also be situations where you have maybe, without having a specific department, you have members of a development team which are the testers. And then finally, we have a situation where it's a one-man show or one-woman show. And today, International Women's Day, we better keep it that way. You have a one-woman show, which is go to develop, test, and reap the profits. Okay, so we have to consider all those different scenarios. And one way of looking at that is to say, right, the functionality of testing is a service that's being provided, but it's a service that is very worthwhile because it will give us an indication that things are working well. Okay, so it's a value service. With any situation where you have a service, there has to be a consumer, and a consumer will buy that service. Okay, that's the way the world works. Okay, so we have to, as if we are the producers of a service, we have to, if you like, sell ourselves to other organizations, be that within a group or within a company or whatever. Okay, so part of the way we can do that is actually using the vehicle of a test plan, and also there's a certain degree of rigor and procedure that should be applied in developing a test plan. And again, that could be done, if you like, with our test plan philosophy that we have here. So the test plan itself, what is it? It's a detailed document describing the appropriate approach to testing a piece of software. So as your requirement for the continuous assessment is to develop a test plan, this affects you. So think of it in the context of your assignment that's coming up. Now, it should help other stakeholders, developers, business managers, clients, etc., understand the tests and details. Okay, so part of the plan is in developing the plan, is to allow others to know what is actually going to be tested. Okay, and it helps those stakeholders. So if you are a testing company and I go to you and say, right, I want you to test this piece of software, right, you have to come back and tell me what you're testing, and you also have to go back and tell me how much is it going to cost. Okay, and you also have to come back and tell me how effective is the testing going to be. So there's a lot of questions that the test plan is designed to answer. Okay, and hopefully we'll see that as we go through it. Writing the test plan helps to figure out the effort required to validate the quality of the software under test, or SUT, software under test. So it's the application under test. You'll sometimes hear AUT, but what we're doing is the test plan will help us to figure out what's required. And once we know what's required, we can then put a cost figure associated with that, because we can determine what resources are required, and we can then put a price on it. So breaking down the process of testing under specific headings helps to clarify how much work will be needed. So, and I guess if we think about it, right, the assessment that we're currently working on is to test your small scale application that you're developing. So how big, how small, what should we test, who should do it? Okay, and these are all very valid questions. The development of the test plan should help us to answer those questions as such. The test plan guides thinking. Okay, now there's normally in an organization there'll be a test plan policy, which will actually be how do you actually create a test plan, or what do you need to do, and so forth. So it will have guiding rules in terms of what we should be doing. But this test plan is specific to an application, so it will take those corporate or company policies on board as well. It functions as a rule book for testing that must be followed. So you set up the plan. This is what we agreed is going to be done. therefore it has to be done, because it's not just internal in the organization that it's been agreed, it's also been agreed with the external stakeholders as well. Some components of the test plan, like estimating scope and strategy, can be reused in other projects upon review by the management team. So typically what will happen is there's lots of different decisions have to get made in a business. Okay, so somebody develops a test plan that has to be approved by somebody. Somebody will then go and say, right, we're not doing all this. We can't spend that amount of time or money or effort or whatever. So there'll always be kind of trade-offs and modifications made to the test plan. You could create your test plan for your application for the CA and then realize, oh, it's going to take that long. We don't have time to do it. Okay. So you need to go back and modify it. So there's a couple of steps given here on how to write a test plan. First thing is analyzing the product to be tested, and you should have a good awareness of that because you're developing the product. So that piece should be done for you. Design an appropriate test strategy. By being familiar with the product, you can determine what would be an appropriate way of testing and what should be tested. Now, that appropriate test strategy, that ends up being a sub-document of the test plan. Okay, so it's an important sub-part of it. You need to define the test objectives. So what are the test objectives? Okay, now think about that for a second. What are the test objectives? Is it to test everything? Is it to have 100% completeness, correctness? What is it? Okay, so we need to have that, what our test objectives are. And then we define our test criteria. So how are we going to test and meet those test objectives? Okay. We need to plan and access resource requirements, because once we know the test criteria, we can then say, okay, right, you are going to do this, you're going to do that, you're going to do that. We need to have this in place for you to be able to do this. You need to have that in place to be able to do that. So we start looking at access to resources and so forth. We need to plan the test environment. How are we going to test this? Do we test it using NetBeans? Have you got NetBeans on your computer? Is somebody testing this? If it's a user acceptance test, how are they going to be testing it? Where are we going to actually install the software? Who's going to install the software? All of these questions have to be good. They come into this test environment, because the test environment may well be different than the actual production environment. We need to estimate the time required for tests and schedule them accordingly. So again, you'll do your test plan and then you'll figure out, okay, this is going to take 3 hours. That's going to take 5 hours, 10 hours, 2 weeks, whatever it happens to be. And you then have to kind of manage that inside of the times that you have, the resources that you have, and obviously schedule everything in place. And then you determine the test deliverables. So at the end of this process, what are we going to have? Okay, what is going to be delivered? Now, analyzing the product to be tested. You guys know the product because you've done it. Okay, you're in the process of doing it. But essentially, there's process flow that we can have here in terms of interviewing clients and designers. And this would be more akin to a situation where you've got somebody, a development company, is contacting a testing company, and the testing company then knows nothing about the product. But this can happen in-house as well, because large organizations could well have their own in-house testing, but it may not even be in the same facility. Okay, it could be in a different country. Even if it is all in the same building and all employees are in the one building. Sometimes the left hand does not know what the right hand is doing, particularly when it comes to developing new products. So there could be a new product that's kept under wraps. There's a lot of security in terms of you don't want the market to be aware of what's coming out. So it doesn't really matter. You have to get familiar with what the product is. So that could be interviewing clients, it could be interviewing designers, interviewing developers, reviewing the product and the project documentation. So what did we say we were going to do? What features was there going to be in this? You want to be interested in your case to actually look at what your initial design concepts were for the product that you're looking at, and then compare it to what you actually have at the moment. And then you perform product walkthroughs. So you're actually working through and you're getting familiar with the actual product that has to be tested. Okay. You need to consider who's going to use this application, what will it be used for, how will the application work, what software, hardware does the product use. Okay. Then you design the appropriate test strategy. Okay. Now, these 4 steps are sort of key to your test plan, really. Okay. Because if you get this right, the rest of it should work out fairly okay. It's a high-level document developed by the test manager. So that's where you're thinking of in terms of what we're looking at here, the test strategy, right? So this would be kind of corporately designed or company designed that, okay, this is our philosophy. The actual test strategy document will define testing objectives and how to achieve them. So there could well be that may change specifically per project, but there should be a general view within the company as to how things should be done. It will determine the need for testing and the costs that will be incurred. So we're defining the scope of testing, identifying the tests and types, documenting the risks and issues, and creating the test logistics is the nub of the whole thing here. Define the scope. You're not going to be able to test everything. Okay. So what we have to look at here is we have to say, well, what are we going to test, or what's in scope? Okay. What are the things we're going to use? Anything that is not going to be tested needs to be explicitly defined as out of scope. So when we look at what we're looking at the moment now for this upcoming CA, okay, and there was a reference made to there beforehand. Do you have to test everything? Okay. No, but do you have to outline what you're going to test and what you're not going to test? Yes. Okay. Now, this isn't just a simple saying, right, okay, right, I'm going to test log in and sign in, and that's it. Okay. This is a case of, I'm not going to test X because, and you're kind of justifying it. Okay. You can't really say, right, I'm not going to test X because we don't have that working yet. Testing has nothing to do with whether something is working correctly or not. Now, if something isn't developed yet, obviously you can't test it, right? And that's valid. You're looking at your test plan for testing the complete product, but we know we're doing this at a point in time where the whole product is not complete. So it's quite acceptable to say, right, we can't test this feature because it hasn't been developed yet or it's only in development. Remember, the development team will only bring something or let something get tested when they're quite happy that it's going to pass the testing. Okay, so a testing department won't have access to all of the code and shouldn't have. Okay, so what we need to do is say what's in the scope, and we also need to explicitly say what's not in the scope or outside of it. So you might look and say, right, you're doing a web application, right? Is it going to include testing the ISP? Okay, you probably haven't even thought about having it on ISP at this stage, so obviously the answer would be no. But you need to explicitly say, no, we're not. Okay, why do we need to do that? Okay, think about this for a second. So let's say I'm the customer and you've come back to me and said, right, we've tested all of that, Peter, and it's all working. Okay, I said, great. My expectation now is I've bought an application that's going to be deployed on the internet, and you've just told me that everything's working. So I can sit back happy as that because I know ISP is working, I know all the interfaces is working, it's working across all different types of browsers, every type of device, it's my phone or whatever. Why? Because you didn't tell me you didn't. Okay. So we have to be very, very careful. We have to, in our, particularly that section there, what's out of scope. And what's out of scope may be out of scope at this point in time, may not be out of scope in a month's time. Okay, when we're doing a second one. Does the test include all possible devices or on which the software might be used? Does it include all possible interacting software? Explicitly lists what is and isn't to be tested. Gives all those involved a level of confidence in the test being carried out, the product being tested. And remember, all this stuff is agreed up front. So it's not a case of coming to your client and saying, okay, we're finished testing phase 1. And I know, because it's been part of our agreement, what's included in phase 1 and what's not included in phase 1. I know when it gets to phase 2, there'll be different set, in phase 3, and depending on how many phases there is. So a lot of the test plan actually helps with this communication process. Okay. We should know the full scope of testing, that it provides all members with a clear understanding of what is and what isn't being tested. Okay, so that's very, very important. So what will happen in terms of your test plan when I read it is I will look at that and I'll say, okay, right, I have an understanding of what's being tested. Now, if I then look at your code and I look at your application and I see things that haven't been mentioned, that's not been tested, I will work on the assumption that they have been tested. Okay. And if they haven't been tested, then I will feel a bit disappointed and resulting in lower marks. Okay. So just bear that in mind. Need to determine the test scope. Okay. Now, test scope is essentially endless because we could go testing forever and ever and ever. Will this thing work on the 14th of March? Will it work on the 30th of June? Will it work on the 25th of December? Will it work in 2030? Right? I don't know. Do we care? Probably not. Okay. But if we're going to test, we could say that testing is an endless situation. Will it work if I've got 5 million users? Will it work if I've got 30 million users? Okay. Will it work if I've got 3 users? So, these are all things we have to look at. Testing can be as broad and as deep as testers are willing to go. In fact, if you went at its broadest, you would never have any product because you would still be testing. Okay. So we can never be 100% confident that everything is working. What we have to do is we have to agree a percentage confidence level that we have and target it, okay? And target the steps that we need to be able to achieve that so that we can say, right, we have got this tested, because testing and the scope is dictated by a combination of the customer requirements, the budget, time frame, the testing tool, and the resources that are available. And defining the final testing scope may require multiple sets of decisions to resolve or discussions to resolve and figure this whole thing out, okay? Because there isn't an endless budget. There isn't a defined set of customer requirements. There is not definitely a suitable time frame, okay? And the testing tools and resources availability, they can change as well, okay? So we're never going to get to a situation where, even if you take the environment, the testing environment, okay, we're not going to have a situation if you take, say, that you've an application that could potentially have 1,000 users simultaneously, 1,000 users. We're not going to get a testing situation where we probably would even have 1,000 users in our database. Never mind actually actively working with 1,000 users. Okay, so there's always going to be some kind of trade-off. The budget is probably the biggest trade-off because budget will determine what set of customer requirements are going to be actually fixed and tested. Okay, so a customer will say, right, I want you to test this, right? And as a customer, I'm thinking, yeah, I'm going to get everything tested. But as a testing company, I'm there saying you want to test it, but you've only got X amount of euro. Okay, so that's an immediate trade-off. Okay, and we might have the customer wants you to widen the scope of testing to test the API. However, the budget for the project is insufficient to accommodate this, right? So your customer does not see that testing is extra work and will consume resources. But if you have a properly formulated testing plan, they should be able to see that, right? So what you need to do is you need to discuss and explain the situation and say that, okay, if you want to test this, that means a certain amount of work has to be done to create and run the tests. This is logical and realistic. Okay. Now, if you're doing that, that's going to cost X amount of money. Okay. So you either then say, right, we need to find X amount of money. Let's say a particular new test the customer wants will cost, say, €100. Okay, which might seem much. Okay, but it costs €100 to develop the test, and you might have a couple of hours work of somebody developing a test for it, and then the actual test being run. Maybe there's extra hardware is required or something. Somebody has to be scheduled to actually run the test and so forth. So you've got you're able to clearly define how much this test is going to cost. And you say, right, you're going to be €100 over the mark here, over the budget. So where do we the options are either the customer says, okay, Rand, into the wallet, take it out, there's an extra €100 we could go with. Or it could be, well, yeah, that's very important to me. This other thing here isn't just as important. So I want you to stop testing that and test this. So you could, if you like, swap out pieces of testing. Okay. Now, the important thing here is, of course, you can't do that after you've, like if you've spent a lot of time creating a unit test and you've put a cost associated with creating this unit test of €100, and the customer says, right, well, take that out and put this one in. That doesn't work because you've already spent the money on it. Okay, so this is all done at the planning stage. Okay, so you've planned all of this. The final result, the customer doesn't have sufficient budget and either cuts a different area scope to include the API testing, or increases the budget, or decides the API testing isn't all that important after all. Okay, so there will be issues like that. The different types of tests involved, and we've probably seen all of this before, your unit testing, your API testing, integration testing, system testing, install, uninstall testing, agile testing, and obviously when it comes to performance testing, we'll look at it, but for the moment we don't have to worry about that. So these are, we'll be looking essentially in terms of just probably looking at the unit testing, at the API testing. However, for your test plan, okay, I want you to consider all of these levels. Okay, and you put it in, that'd be phase 2 or phase 3 or whatever of testing. Okay, but you need to consider it. Which testing types to use? Again, this is where you start getting in. You might say to yourself, okay, well, we don't have any of these things. You've got a time frame. Okay, you've got a budget in terms of the number of hours that you as a team have available. Okay, to do all of this. So put that into the constraints that you have. You have testing tools and resources available. So you have made decisions as a team so far as to the type of unit testing you're doing, the type of Mockito we're using, and then whatever platform you're using for the BDD, for Gherkin and so forth. So you have, to a certain extent, constraints. Customer requirements, then, that's kind of coming in from my side, right? I want a well-tested thing, and put me down as a naive customer. I don't know exactly what I want, right? But remember what we've said up to this. Part of this is all to do with having discussions and conversations. Okay, so in an attempt to simulate that, that's why we're doing this in conjunction with the classes. So I would have an expectation. Okay, remember, I'm the client. Okay, so what I will need you to do, if you're making a decision in terms of what you're going to test, what you're not going to test, right? You need to have that discussion with me. Okay, and that's what we'll do during in the coming weeks, is we'll have space, within our scheduled classes to have that discussion. Okay, so that's an important thing you need to be aware of. Your testing process cannot handle all types of testing. They must be prioritized. You have constraints, and in business you'll have constraints as well. Okay, so we're trying to get this as real to life as possible. Okay, what testing should be prioritized? What testing can be ignored to save on cost? So you can only do that if you've actually identified all the testing that has to be done. Okay, so that's an important thing there. You can't say, well, I'm not going to test X unless you've actually determined what X is, and that you have an awareness that X exists in the first place. Okay, so look at that in terms of defining the scope and so forth. The priorities will depend on the sort of application you're testing naturally, okay, and what stage and phase you're at in the development of that product. Okay, so bear that in mind as well. Okay, priorities will also depend on the fact that, to a certain extent, I've kind of prioritized things by saying we've got the 3 main areas that we need to look at. Then you need to document risks and issues, right? So remember, risk is an uncertain event from the future with a probability of occurrence and a potential for loss. What would happen to the cost of it would be the cost of it happening. When an event occurs, it moves from being a risk to being an issue. Okay, so you need to document what are the possible risks. Okay, and then you also need to determine that if a risk happens, what is the issue. Okay, so it's important to have an understanding of what the two of them mean and the difference between them. So you list all possible events that could occur, and then you're noting the potential loss associated with each. Okay. For each risk, there should be an associated migration strategies to minimize the potential loss. Okay, training for staff involved, documenting to encode priorities, scope of the project, etc. Okay, so where we see a risk, we try to put in something that will mitigate against that risk, which is standard project management process as such. Then the planning, the test, logistics. Okay, so again, this is something that you need to plan. Okay, because you're going to have X amount of time to be able to do this. Uh, who will do the test? When will the test happen? So you've put a schedule, and inside that there should be some indication as to how long it's going to take to do the test. Okay. Um, who will do the test? Don't need to name specific staff members, although in your case there's only 3, so you probably will. Okay. So Peter will do this, and Jack will do that, and Jane will do something else. Okay. It's sufficient to say the type of tester who will carry out the test. So if somebody's doing unit tests, and you obviously have to have somebody in there who is close to the development. Okay. If somebody is doing BDD, then you don't necessarily need to have somebody who's familiar with the ins and outs. So it's all this white box, black box testing as such. Based on budget and requirements, you can either select from in-house or outsource. Right? You don't have that option. You can't outsource this to somebody. You're going to have to do it yourself in-house. Okay. When will the test happen? Ideally before the 22nd, we would say, right? But they must be paced against associated development activities. Okay, so you need to start tying in what you're going to test with what is going to be available in terms of your project. Okay, so again, this will vary between groups depending on the state your project is at. Define the test objectives, overall goal, achievement of tests being carried out. The objective of all testing is always to find as many defaults, flaws as possible to ensure the software is defect-free before release. Okay, and to define the objectives, you list all the features, functionality that may need testing. You define the goal of the test based on the functionality, and that may need analysis from a behavior-driven development point of view as well. Okay, so that's defining your test objectives. Okay, so all of the features have to be listed that need to be tested, and then define the goal of the testing. So are we going to test all of these? Are we going to test all of these in every way possible? Is it possible if we tested using BDD here that we wouldn't have to spend time testing, maybe unit testing or API testing previously? Okay, so these are questions and decisions that you have to make. You then define the test criteria, and again, I want to see examples of this in the documents that are produced. Standard rule in which test procedure judgment can be based. And the two main ones are the suspension criteria and the exit criteria. So suspension criteria will cause the test cycle to be suspended or paused until the criteria is resolved. So if, for example, you're doing testing and it fails, it will possibly prevent future testing or the next planned test to occur until such point in time as that criteria has been corrected. Okay. The exit criteria then is will denote successful completion of a test phase. Right. Criteria dictate when a product is deemed to have passed a specified test phase. Okay. Doesn't necessarily mean that it's passed everything. Okay. But it's passed enough to be able to move on to the next stage of testing. Okay. Now, this is where I think there's a philosophical issue here. If we have a test and it fails, how can we say that the test has passed? Okay, or how can we say that we can exit the testing criteria? Okay, and that's a difficult one for us to get our heads around. Okay, but it is something that we have to look at and consider, because what we're looking at here is if the suspended criteria are met during a test cycle, testing is stopped, products are sent back to developers for fixing. Testing will not restart until whatever criteria caused the cycle to be paused or addressed and related issues are repaired. So an example criteria: if testers report 40% of tests failed, suspend testing until all failed cases are fixed. So you could have, and we saw examples of this, and it will have an impact on, even like if we look at the Selenium stuff from last week, whether you use assert or verify will determine whether or not a test case is run or stop. Run and record a failure or stop and say, oh, I'm not going any further. So that's the type of thing you have to look at here. You might well say that you're going to go until you get a point where you've got like 5 items have failed, and then at that point it's acceptable to send it back to the developers to fix those 5 items, rather than the other alternative would be, okay, you run a test, it fails, you send it back. So you're sitting around there waiting for this to go back from the developers. It goes back 2 days later, you run it again, and it passed that test, but it fails the next one. Okay, and you send it back, and you're sitting around for 2 days. Okay, now you know yourself as developers, you get a piece of code that you have to fix. It takes you a wee while to get into the zone, set up your environment, blah blah blah, and work with it. If you're in a big organization, okay, if the developer has, the developer, when they send the piece of code off to get tested, they're not sitting there waiting for a signal from yourself saying that it's okay. No, they're off working on a different project, which is being scheduled and timed. Okay, so you can't just be sending stuff in and say, "Okay, Peter, away from there now, back in and fix this bug." Okay, there's a whole lot of politics in this whole thing in terms of, the developer is working on something, and for the testing team to come back with something they worked on last week to say there's a bug in it, they have to put down what they're doing at the moment, look at it, fix it, send it back, then pick up what they were working on, which isn't at all efficient. Okay, so sometimes it's good to say, well, listen, maybe we'll just get 5 of these and we'll send it back and say, right, there's 5 of these aren't working, and let the development team work on that. These are like internal issues that have to get resolved all the time. So exit criteria specifies successful completion of test phase. The target results of a test must occur before production can proceed to the next test phase, right? So it could be that 95% of critical tests pass. Okay, and that allows you to move on to the next phase of testing, right? A common approach is to define exit criteria based on specific target run and pass rates. So the run rate is the number of tests executed divided by the total number of test cases. So we could have, say, 100 test cases, but the testers only executed 20 of them. Okay. Pass rate then, test cases divided by the test cases executed. Test cases passed divided by test cases executed. So the tester has executed 75 test cases and 60 of them passed, giving a pass rate of 60 out of 75 or 80%. Right. The run rate should always be 100% unless there's good justification given. The pass rate depends on the project scope. However, higher pass rate is always the goal. We always want to run every test and have every test passing, but there is a reality check, and the reality check is that that doesn't necessarily always happen. The lower the pass rate, the less reliable the product is. The higher the number of tests, the higher the cost. Therefore, the bigger the budget. Therefore, the longer the period of time. You think of those constraints we spoke of a few minutes ago. This is a balancing act between all of that. Okay. And you definitely have to bring the client in on it. Planning resources then to carry out your test plan. So what you've done now, you've figured out all the things you have to test. You figured out what you're going to test, what you're not going to test. You figured out how many times you're going to test the different test cases and what the pass rate is going to be. So now you're going to figure out how do you plan your resources. Okay. So you need to allocate sufficient resources. Now, this is a little bit, planning resources is very complex because there's a certain degree of the amount of resources you need will depend really on how many problems you find, right? If you have tests and the product comes in and runs through and doesn't have any failures, okay, you could say, brilliant, right? I have saved money on my test time. If you have tests and it fails loads of times and is back in with the developers and then back into tests and then back into the developers and then back into tests, you're spending more and more test resources doing that and developer resources. Okay. You could look and say, well, if you have testing and everything passes, that your tests aren't good enough. Okay. You could have something that says, well, if every test is failing, then maybe there's a problem with the actual testing and how we're actually communicating what we should be doing, which is true as well. Okay, so this is planning resources very, very tricky in anything. It should be a detailed summary of all types of resources required. Staff to carry out the testing, equipment to run the tests on, software licenses to carry tests, materials, etc., etc., etc. Okay. Resource planning is a critical component of the test plan as it helps determine the number of employees the project will need. Knowing the required resource to help calculate the cost of the project as well as work out its schedule. Now, if we look at some of the, we haven't covered them yet, but there's other packages out there I'm sure some of you've come across in terms of, we're looking at BDD. The ones you actually pay for, the ones like SmartBear and so forth, where you have to actually get a license and so forth. That's part of the resources. So in terms of your planning, if you've got a 30-day free license on it, and you need to test for 60 days, okay, which I know we won't have. You might be there saying, right, well, how am I going to get the second free license, or do I pay for it, or that kind of thing? Okay, so these are all important constraints. There will well be times when you'll find that you're going to have to actually go and spend a bit of money on something. Okay. So the example plan for human resources then, test manager manages the entire project, defines the project direction, acquires the appropriate necessary resources. I would suggest that one of you and your team become the test manager for this. Testers then will obviously be the three of you. Executes the test, logs the results, and reports the defects. So that's an important part there that has to be done by the tester. Test developer, you will all be doing a piece of that for the different sections that you do. Test administrator will support the test environment, and then SQA members will, software quality members will take charge of quality assurance. Okay, you probably will do all of that yourselves. Okay. Here's an example here that what you might want for the server: install the web application under test. Then you have some test tools that automate the tests. Some here examples given: network and a computer. So again, you're looking at the resources that you would require for something, but it's all been planned out. Particularly if you think, now let's say you were going to get somebody else to do the testing. Okay. Plan the test environment. Setting up the, sometimes I know a company I worked with, we developed software years ago for banks and that, and part of the test environment there was you had to actually get it installed on, their test servers, but their test servers were in secured areas within the bank. So like there's a whole protocol in terms of actually getting software to get in, actually getting people to be allowed in to actually load information up on the actual test software. And this is their test server, which wasn't actually in the production vault. It was a different vault for production stuff. So there's a lot of logistics in that. But you had to order, you had to configure your servers, you had to send the servers over, all sorts of stuff set up had to be done prior to being able to actually even try and test the software. Okay. You might be looking at the maximum number of connections the site can handle at the same time, hardware, software requirements for installing the system. Does the user's computer need specific settings to browse this site, and so forth and so forth and so forth. Like if you're using like an ISP, do you have to actually go, is it your own hardware it's running on? Does that have to be configured? I know with the .com is involved in, we used a company down in Cork, and that's where the servers were. So we had to specify the design in terms of many front end, many middleware, many back end databases, what the configuration for failover was. There was all sorts of testing requirements of testing the actual configuration and the failover capability of software, never mind the actual software itself. So there are lots of implications. The software system is the complete application. Scheduling and estimating, again, fairly straightforward, bringing in, employee and project deadlines, all that kind of stuff. Product risk, project estimation. So how much, how many man hours do you think it's going to take, and how much will it cost, and so forth. Then the test deliverables. So this is part of, and something to be concerned with for the CA. Before the testing, you have the test plan documents, test case documents, and test design specifications. You do that beforehand. During the testing, you have your test scripts, your simulators, your test data, test traceability matrix, error logs, and execution logs. So maybe they're the printouts, the screenshots you get from running the actual tests. Then after testing, test results reports. So that's a report which would say, yes, this has passed this test, okay? Guidelines and release notes. So those three sets of tests, I want to see examples of those as part of the work, submission work.